The fluorescent lights above me flickered as I collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor of Jefferson High School's chemistry lab. When I came to, 23 pairs of eyes stared down at me in horror. But the worst part wasn't waking up disoriented with a bleeding tongue. It wasn't even the humiliation of having wet myself in front of my entire AP chemistry class. The worst part was going home that day and hearing my own mother say, "Stop being so dramatic, Abigail. We all know you're just doing this for attention." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. That was the beginning of 3 years of medical gaslighting that nearly killed me. This is the story of how I fought to prove that my seizures were real. I was 17 when it started, a junior at Jefferson High in Riverside, California. Up until that October afternoon in 2019, I'd been what you'd call the perfect daughter: honor roll student, varsity soccer player, student council treasurer. My parents, Richard and Margaret Thompson, had raised me and my younger brother Lucas to be high achievers. Dad worked as a corporate lawyer downtown. Mom was a pediatric nurse. They were logical, methodical people who believed in facts, evidence, and hard work. Which is probably why they refused to believe what happened to me that Tuesday in Mr. Peterson's chemistry lab. I remember everything leading up to it perfectly. We were working on a titration experiment, and I was carefully adding sodium hydroxide to my solution when suddenly the world started to feel wrong. The sounds around me became muffled, like I was underwater. The fluorescent lights seemed to pulse and strobe. I felt this overwhelming sense of déjà vu, followed by a metallic taste that flooded my mouth. Then, nothing. I woke up on the floor with paramedics crouched over me. My lab partner, Jessica Martinez, was crying. Mr. Peterson looked pale as he explained to the EMTs what he'd witnessed. According to him, I'd suddenly gone rigid, my eyes rolled back, and I'd fallen backward off my stool. Then my entire body started convulsing violently for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The ambulance ride to Riverside General was a blur. I kept drifting in and out of consciousness, my head pounding like someone was using it as a drum. When we arrived, Dr. Sarah Chen, the ER physician, ran through the standard tests: blood work, CT scan, the works. Everything came back normal. "Sometimes stress can cause seizure-like episodes," she explained to my parents, who had rushed over from work, "especially in high-achieving teenagers. Has Abigail been under any unusual pressure lately?" I wanted to scream. I hadn't been stressed about anything. I loved school, I was doing well in all my classes, and soccer season had just ended on a high note. But I was too exhausted to argue. The post-seizure fatigue was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It felt like my brain had been put through a blender. Mom drove me home in silence, while Dad followed in his car. When we got to our house on Maple Street, they sat me down at the kitchen table for what I now realize was my first interrogation. "Abigail, honey," Mom started, using her nurse voice, "Dr. Chen thinks this might be related to stress or anxiety. Is there something going on at school? Problems with friends? Are you worried about college applications?" "No, Mom. I told you, everything's fine. This just happened." Dad leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "But seizures don't just happen to healthy 17-year-olds, Abby. There has to be a reason. Did you hit your head recently? Take any medication? Drink alcohol?" "Dad, I've never even had a sip of beer. You know that." They exchanged a look that I would become very familiar with over the next 3 years. It was the look that said they thought I was lying. Lucas, who was 14 at the time, had been quiet throughout this whole exchange. Finally, he spoke up. "What if she's just sick, like actually sick?" "Lucas, go to your room," Mom said firmly. "This is between us and your sister." After he left, they continued their questioning for another hour. By the end of it, they'd convinced themselves that I was either hiding something or having some kind of psychological breakdown. They scheduled an appointment with Dr. Amanda Foster, a family therapist downtown. I spent the rest of that week at home, supposedly recovering, but really just feeling like a fraud. The seizure had been real. I could still taste the metallic flavor when I thought about it, still feel the soreness in my muscles from the convulsions. But my parents' skepticism was starting to make me doubt my own experience. When I returned to school the following Monday, I was hoping things would go back to normal. Instead, I found myself in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Word had spread about my dramatic collapse in chemistry class. Some kids looked at me with genuine concern, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of morbid fascination that teenagers have for anything medical or dramatic. "Are you epileptic now?" asked Chloe Williams during lunch, as if epilepsy was something you could catch like a cold. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "The doctors aren't sure what happened." That was the truth, but it felt inadequate. I wanted answers as much as everyone else did. 2 weeks later, I had my second seizure. This time, it happened at home, during dinner. We were eating Mom's famous pot roast, the one she made every other Sunday, when that same strange feeling washed over me. The underwater sensation, the pulsing lights, the déjà vu. But this time, I recognized what was happening. "Mom," I managed to say, "I think I'm going to—" I don't remember hitting the dining room floor, but I do remember waking up to Lucas shaking my shoulders and calling my name. Mom was on the phone with 911, and Dad was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "How long was I out?" I asked Lucas. "Like 5 minutes. You were shaking really bad and your lips turned blue." This time, the ER doctor was Dr. Michael Rodriguez. He was younger than Dr. Chen and seemed more willing to take my symptoms seriously. He ordered another round of tests, including an EEG, an electroencephalogram that measures brain activity. But because I wasn't actively having a seizure during the test, it came back normal. "Normal EEGs don't rule out epilepsy," Dr. Rodriguez explained to my parents. "Many people with epilepsy have normal brain activity between seizures. I'd like to refer Abigail to a neurologist for further evaluation." Finally, I thought, someone who believed me. But my parents had other ideas. On the drive home, Dad was the first to voice what they were both thinking. "2 seizures in 2 weeks, both at convenient times when people are watching. Don't you think that's a little suspicious?" "Richard," Mom warned, but he continued. "I'm just saying, teenagers do a lot of things for attention. Remember when your cousin Emily claimed she had chronic fatigue syndrome right before finals?" "This is different," I protested from the back seat. "I'm not making this up." "Honey," Mom said, turning around to face me, "we're not saying you're making it up. We're saying that sometimes our minds can create physical symptoms when we're dealing with emotional stress. It doesn't mean you're lying or crazy. It just means you might need a different kind of help." And that's how I ended up in Dr. Foster's office the next week, talking about my feelings instead of getting the neurological evaluation I desperately needed. Dr. Foster was kind but misguided. She spent our first session trying to uncover the deep-seated trauma that was supposedly causing my pseudo-seizures. When that approach failed, she pivoted to exploring my perfectionist tendencies and fear of failure. "Sometimes, high-achieving students create unconscious ways of escaping pressure," she explained during our third session. "Your seizures might be your mind's way of giving you a break from expectations." I wanted to throw something. These weren't convenient escapes from pressure. They were terrifying, unpredictable events that left me exhausted and confused. But Dr. Foster had a PhD and 30 years of experience. My parents trusted her judgment completely. As the weeks turned into months, my parents became increasingly convinced that my seizures were psychological. They stopped taking me to the ER when they happened. Instead, they would time them with Dad's stopwatch and make notes about what had triggered me. According to their records, I had seizures before big tests, during family gatherings, and whenever I was seeking attention. The irony was that I started going to great lengths to hide my seizures. I'd excuse myself to the bathroom at school when I felt one coming on. I'd lock my bedroom door at home. I became an expert at recognizing the warning signs, the aura, as I later learned it was called, and finding private places to ride them out. But seizures don't care about your desire for privacy. They don't wait for convenient moments or safe spaces. And as mine became more frequent and more severe, hiding them became impossible. The breaking point came 6 months after that first seizure in chemistry class. I was at the mall with my best friend, Samantha Brooks, shopping for prom dresses. We were in Nordstrom, laughing about some ridiculous puffy pink monstrosity, when I felt the familiar underwater sensation. "Sam," I said, grabbing her arm, "I need to sit down." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But there was no time. The seizure hit me like a freight train right there in the middle of the dress department. When I came to, I was surrounded by concerned shoppers and mall security. An ambulance was already on its way. This time, something was different. This time, I didn't wake up confused but otherwise okay. This time, I couldn't move the left side of my body. Samantha rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand and trying not to cry. "Abby, your parents don't believe you're really sick, do they?" I couldn't answer. My speech was still slurred from whatever had happened in my brain, but I squeezed her hand. Someone finally understood. The neurologist at Riverside General, Dr. Patricia Valdez, was different from the ER doctors I'd encountered before. She actually listened when I described my symptoms and took detailed notes about each seizure episode. The partial paralysis on my left side had resolved within hours, but she was clearly concerned about what it meant. "Temporary weakness following a seizure is called Todd's paralysis," she explained to my parents and me. "It's a strong indicator that we're dealing with focal seizures originating from a specific area of the brain." For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Here was a medical professional who understood what was happening to me. Dr. Valdez ordered a comprehensive workup, blood tests to check for metabolic causes, a sleep-deprived EEG to try to capture abnormal brain activity, and an MRI to rule out structural abnormalities. She also prescribed a low dose of Keppra, an anti-seizure medication, as a precautionary measure. "Even if the tests come back normal," she told us, "clinical presentation is often enough to make a diagnosis of epilepsy. Abigail's symptoms are very consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy." I could see my parents processing this information, and I watched their faces carefully. Dad's expression was unreadable, his lawyer poker face. Mom looked skeptical, her nursing background making her question everything. "Doctor," Mom interjected, "we've been working with a therapist who thinks these episodes might be psychosomatic. Abigail's been under a lot of academic pressure, and the timing of these seizures often coincides with stressful situations." Dr. Valdez nodded politely but firmly. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand that concern, but pseudo-seizures typically look very different from what you've described. The Todd's paralysis Abigail experienced is particularly difficult to fake and strongly suggests genuine epileptic activity." The ride home was tense. Dad drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. Mom stared out the passenger window. I sat in the back, clutching the prescription bottle of Keppra like a lifeline. "I don't like the idea of putting you on seizure medication if we're not even sure that's what this is," Mom finally said. "Those drugs have serious side effects." "But what if Dr. Valdez is right?" I asked. "What if I really do have epilepsy?" "Then we'll deal with it when we know for sure," Dad replied. "But I'm not comfortable with a 17-year-old taking psychiatric medication based on guesswork." "It's not psychiatric medication, Dad. It's anti-seizure medication," he said, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this diagnosis. When we got home, they made a decision that would define the next 2 years of my life. They decided not to fill the prescription. Instead, they scheduled more sessions with Dr. Foster and implemented what they called seizure protocols. These protocols were humiliating. Whenever I reported feeling strange or mentioned any neurological symptoms, they would make me sit in the living room where they could observe me. Dad would start his stopwatch, and Mom would take notes on my behavior. They were looking for evidence that my seizures were voluntary, eye movement patterns that seemed too controlled, convenient timing, quick recovery without the typical post-seizure confusion. The worst part was that they started involving Lucas in their observations. My 14-year-old brother became another set of eyes, reporting back to our parents about anything unusual he noticed about my behavior. Abby seemed fine at breakfast, but then she went upstairs and came down acting all weird and shaky, he reported one morning after I'd had a small focal seizure in my bedroom. I felt completely isolated. Even my own family was building a case against me. School became my refuge, but even that was complicated. I'd confided in Samantha about what was happening at home, and she was furious on my behalf. "Your parents are literally ignoring medical advice," she said during lunch one day. "That's insane." "They think they know better because my mom's a nurse and my dad's used to evaluating evidence." "Yeah, well, they're not neurologists," Samantha pointed out, "and you're not a court case to be won or lost." Her support meant everything to me, but it also highlighted how alone I was in my own family. Samantha believed me completely, never questioned my symptoms, and even started researching epilepsy online to better understand what I was going through. Meanwhile, my seizures were getting worse. The focal seizures, the smaller ones that didn't involve full-body convulsions, were happening almost daily. I'd lose awareness for 30 seconds to 2 minutes, sometimes in the middle of conversations or classes. My teacher started to notice. Mrs. Rodriguez, my AP literature teacher, pulled me aside after class one Thursday afternoon. "Abigail, is everything okay? You seem to zone out sometimes during discussions, and yesterday you didn't respond when I called your name 3 times." I didn't know how to explain that I was having seizures that my own parents didn't believe in. I said vaguely, "My family is working on figuring it out." She looked concerned, but didn't push further. "Well, if you need any accommodations or extensions on assignments, please let me know. Your grades have always been excellent, but I've noticed some changes in your work lately." She was right. My cognitive function was declining, though I didn't understand why at the time. I later learned that frequent seizures can cause cumulative brain fog and memory problems. Simple tasks that used to be effortless, like solving calculus problems or writing essays, now required enormous concentration. I was constantly exhausted. At home, my parents interpreted my academic struggles as further evidence of their psychosomatic theory. "See," Mom said, when my report card showed B's instead of my usual A's, "this is all connected. The attention-seeking behavior, the declining grades, the drama with these so-called seizures. You're overwhelmed, honey, and your mind is creating these symptoms as an escape." Dr. Foster agreed with them. During our sessions, she kept trying to get me to admit that I was consciously triggering my seizures as a coping mechanism. "Abigail, there's no shame in acknowledging that you've developed a maladaptive response to stress," she said during one particularly frustrating appointment. "Many intelligent, high-achieving individuals create elaborate unconscious strategies to avoid situations that feel overwhelming." "But I'm not trying to avoid anything," I insisted. "These seizures are ruining my life. Why would I want them to happen?" "The unconscious mind doesn't always work logically," she replied. "Sometimes we create problems that feel more manageable than the ones we're actually facing." I stopped talking in therapy after that. There was no point in trying to convince someone who had already decided what my truth should be. The real turning point came during spring break of my senior year. We'd planned a family trip to visit my grandparents in Phoenix. Grandma Helen and Grandpa Frank had always been my allies. They were the ones who listened to me, who took my concerns seriously, who treated me like my thoughts and feelings mattered. On our second day there, I had a massive, generalized tonic-clonic seizure in my grandparents' living room. This wasn't like my previous seizures. It was violent, lasted nearly 10 minutes, and left me unconscious for over an hour afterward. Grandpa Frank, a retired paramedic, immediately called 911, despite my parents' protests. "She needs medical attention," he told Dad firmly. "I don't care what you think is causing this. That seizure could have killed her." At Phoenix General Hospital, the emergency physician, Dr. James Wright, was appalled when he learned about my medical history. "You mean to tell me that this young woman has been having seizures for 8 months, was prescribed anti-seizure medication by a neurologist, and you chose not to fill the prescription?" he asked my parents pointedly. "We weren't convinced the diagnosis was accurate," Dad replied defensively. "Well, I am," Dr. Wright said. "I'm starting her on IV Ativan to prevent status epilepticus, and I'm admitting her for observation. She needs to see a neurologist immediately when you get back to California." The 3 days I spent in that Phoenix hospital were the first time in months that I felt safe.
The nurses believed my symptoms, the doctors took my seizures seriously, and nobody questioned whether I was making everything up for attention. But the real validation came from an unexpected source, Grandma Helen. She sat beside my hospital bed on the second day and took my hand. "Sweetheart, I need to tell you something about our family that your parents don't know." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" "Your great-aunt Margaret, your mom's aunt, had epilepsy." This was back in the 1960s when people didn't understand it very well. The family was so ashamed that they made her live in a state institution for most of her adult life. I stared at her in shock. "Mom doesn't know?" "Your grandmother, my sister, never told her children about Margaret. She was too embarrassed, but I always wondered if it might show up again in the family. Epilepsy can be genetic, you know." For the first time in 8 months, I cried tears of relief instead of frustration. There was a medical explanation for what was happening to me. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't attention-seeking, and I wasn't alone. When I shared this information with my parents, I expected them to finally understand. Instead, Mom became defensive about not knowing her family's medical history, and Dad questioned whether Grandma Helen was remembering correctly. "She's 83 years old, Abby," he said. "Memory isn't always reliable at that age." But Grandpa Frank backed up his wife's story completely. "Margaret was my sister-in-law," he told them. "I remember visiting her at the state hospital. She had terrible seizures, but back then, they just locked people away instead of treating them properly." The flight back to California was silent. I knew my parents were processing this new information, but I also knew it would take more than family history to convince them that I was telling the truth. I had no idea that the proof they needed was just a few weeks away. Back in Riverside, my parents reluctantly agreed to schedule a follow-up appointment with Dr. Valdez, but only after Grandpa Frank threatened to call Child Protective Services if they continued to deny me medical care. The appointment was set for 2 weeks after our return from Phoenix, but those 2 weeks would prove to be the most dangerous of my life. My seizures had become more frequent and unpredictable since the major episode at my grandparents' house. I was having focal seizures almost daily now, and the generalized ones were coming every few days instead of every few weeks. The constant electrical storms in my brain were taking a serious toll on my cognitive function and physical health. At school, I'd started having seizures in front of my classmates regularly. My AP government teacher, Mr. Harrison, had to call the nurse's office 3 times in 1 week when I would suddenly stop mid-sentence during class presentations and stare blankly at the wall for 2 minutes at a time. Principal Martinez called my parents in for a meeting. "I'm concerned about Abigail's safety," she told them in her office that Monday morning. I sat between my parents, feeling like I was on trial. "She's had several episodes in class, and last week she had what appeared to be a seizure during a fire drill. If something serious happens on school property, we need to know there's a proper medical plan in place." Dad pulled out a folder he'd prepared, because of course he had. "We're working with both a neurologist and a therapist to determine the exact nature of Abigail's episodes. Until we have a definitive diagnosis, we feel it's premature to put emergency protocols in place for what may be anxiety-related incidents." Principal Martinez looked skeptical. "Mr. Thompson, I've been an educator for 25 years. I've seen anxiety attacks, panic disorders, and attention-seeking behavior. What I'm witnessing with Abigail looks like seizure activity. Has she been evaluated by a neurologist recently?" "We have an appointment scheduled," Mom answered evasively. What they didn't tell Principal Martinez was that they'd specifically requested Dr. Valdez refer them to a different neurologist, one who might be more objective about my condition. They'd found Dr. Robert Chen, a neurologist in Los Angeles who specialized in differentiating between epileptic seizures and psychogenic episodes. The drive to Dr. Chen's office in downtown LA took 90 minutes in traffic. During the drive, I had 2 focal seizures that left me disoriented and nauseated. My parents noted the timing in their ever-present seizure journal. Dad had started documenting everything with the thoroughness of a legal brief. "Seizure at 2:23 p.m., lasting approximately 90 seconds, occurred during discussion about an upcoming neurologist appointment," he dictated to Mom, who wrote it down. The patient exhibited staring, lip-smacking, and claimed confusion afterward. Patient, that's what I'd become to my own father. Dr. Chen was everything my parents had hoped for. He was skeptical from the moment we walked into his office. Instead of asking me about my symptoms, he spent the first 20 minutes of our appointment interviewing my parents about my psychological state, academic pressures, and family dynamics. "How does Abigail typically respond to stress?" he asked them. "She's always been a bit dramatic," Mom answered. "Even as a child, she had a flair for the theatrical when she didn't get her way." I wanted to interrupt, to defend myself, but I'd learned that speaking up only made things worse. They'd paint it as more evidence of my supposed attention-seeking behavior. Dr. Chen nodded as he took notes. "And these episodes, do they ever happen when she's alone?" "That's just it," Dad said, leaning forward. "They almost always happen when people are watching. At school, during family dinners, at the mall with friends. It's quite a coincidence." "Actually," I finally spoke up, "they happen when I'm alone all the time. I just don't tell you about those anymore because you don't believe me anymore." The look that passed between my parents and Dr. Chen told me everything I needed to know about how that statement was being interpreted.
Dr. Chen's examination was perfunctory. He ordered another EEG, this time specifically to look for signs of psychogenic seizures versus epileptic ones. He also recommended psychological testing to assess for conversion disorder and other psychiatric conditions that could manifest as neurological symptoms. "I want to be very clear about something," he told my parents as the appointment ended. "True epilepsy is relatively rare in teenagers without a clear precipitating cause. What's much more common are psychogenic, non-epileptic seizures, especially in high-achieving young women under academic or social stress." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Here was another doctor who'd made up his mind about my condition before even properly examining me. The psychological testing took place over 3 grueling sessions with Dr. Margaret Foster. Yes, the same Dr. Foster who'd been trying to cure my conversion disorder for months. The tests were designed to identify malingering, factitious disorders, and other conditions where patients either consciously or unconsciously create symptoms. During one particularly humiliating session, she hooked me up to a fake EEG machine, basically a bunch of electrodes that weren't connected to anything, and told me to try to have a seizure. "If you can produce seizure-like activity on command," she explained, "it would indicate that your episodes are under conscious control." I sat there for an hour, electrodes plastered to my scalp, while she waited for me to perform my supposed fake seizures. When nothing happened, she made notes about my resistance to demonstration. Meanwhile, my real seizures were getting progressively worse. I'd started having what I later learned were called clusters, multiple seizures occurring within a short time frame. I'd have 3 or 4 focal seizures in a single afternoon, followed by a generalized seizure that would leave me unconscious and disoriented. The Friday before my scheduled appointment to get the EEG results from Dr. Chen, something happened that should have been a wake-up call for everyone involved. I was in AP Calculus when I felt the familiar aura beginning. The underwater sensation, the metallic taste, the sense that everything around me was becoming unreal. I tried to excuse myself to the bathroom, but before I could even raise my hand, the seizure hit. This time was different. Instead of my usual focal seizure with brief loss of awareness, I went straight into a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. In front of 30 classmates and Mrs. Patterson, I collapsed out of my desk and began convulsing violently on the classroom floor. What made this seizure particularly dangerous was that it didn't stop. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Mrs. Patterson had called 911 immediately, but by the time the paramedics arrived, I'd been seizing continuously for 12 minutes. Status epilepticus, a seizure lasting longer than 5 minutes, is a medical emergency. It can cause permanent brain damage or death if not treated immediately. The paramedics had to administer IV Ativan to stop the seizure, and I was rushed to Riverside General in critical condition. I woke up in the ICU 18 hours later with no memory of what had happened. My parents were there, along with Dr. Valdez, who had been called in as the consulting neurologist. "Abigail experienced status epilepticus," she explained to my groggy, confused brain. "This is a serious medical emergency that proves definitively that you have epilepsy. There is no psychological condition that can cause a 12-minute generalized seizure with post-ictal coma."
I looked at my parents, expecting to see relief or apology or at least acknowledgement that they'd been wrong. Instead, I saw something that broke my heart. They still looked skeptical. How do we know she didn't somehow trigger this episode intentionally? Dad asked Dr. Valdez. We've been working with specialists who think her seizures might be psychosomatic. Dr. Valdez stared at him in disbelief. Mr. Thompson, your daughter nearly died yesterday. Status epilepticus cannot be faked or psychosomatically induced. The neurological damage from prolonged seizure activity is measurable and real. She pulled up my brain scans on the computer in my ICU room. See these areas of hyperintensity? That's evidence of seizure-related brain injury. This is not psychological, not attention-seeking, and not something that can be willed into existence. Finally, I had the proof I needed, or so I thought. After 3 days in the hospital, during which I had 2 more seizures despite being on high-dose IV anti-seizure medications, Dr. Valdez sat down with my family for a comprehensive discussion about epilepsy management. Abigail needs to be on a therapeutic dose of anti-seizure medication immediately, she said firmly. The Keppra I prescribed months ago would have prevented yesterday's status epilepticus. Her seizures are clearly not controlled, and every episode puts her at risk for permanent neurological damage. She also recommended genetic testing to look for inherited epilepsy syndromes, given the family history we'd recently discovered. Temporal lobe epilepsy can have genetic components, and understanding the specific type of epilepsy Abigail has will help us choose the most effective treatment. My parents listened politely, but I could see them exchanging their familiar skeptical glances. Even with brain scans showing seizure damage, even with genetic evidence, even with a near-death experience, they weren't ready to admit they'd been wrong. The drive home from the hospital was quiet, except for the sound of Dad's fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Finally, Mom broke the silence. "We'll fill the prescription this time," she said, "but I still think we need to continue with Dr. Foster. Just because you had a serious episode doesn't mean the underlying cause isn't psychological stress." I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the car window. I was 18 years old. I'd nearly died from a preventable medical emergency, and my own parents still thought I was making it all up for attention. But something had changed in me during those 3 days in the ICU. Maybe it was the brain injury from the status epilepticus, or maybe it was finally having undeniable proof of my condition. Whatever it was, I was done trying to convince them. I was going to take control of my own medical care, with or without their support. Turning 18 3 weeks after my ICU stay was more than just a birthday milestone. It was my legal independence. The moment I blew out the candles on my cake, sitting at our kitchen table with bandages still covering the IV sites on my arms, I knew exactly what I was going to do. My parents had reluctantly filled the Keppra prescription, but they were administering it like prison wardens. Dad kept the medication bottle locked in his desk drawer and personally supervised each dose, noting the time and date in his seizure journal. They'd also scheduled me for more psychological evaluations with a psychiatrist in Newport Beach who specialized in medically unexplained symptoms. Mom explained as we drove to my first appointment that Dr. Williams had had excellent success helping young people understand the connection between emotional stress and physical symptoms. She's worked with several teenagers who developed seizure-like episodes during periods of academic pressure. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the orange groves blur past, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to this appointment. I wasn't going to any more appointments that started with the assumption that I was either lying or mentally ill. When we arrived at Dr. Williams' office, I told my parents I needed to use the bathroom. Instead, I walked straight out the front door of the medical building and called Samantha. "Can you pick me up?" I asked when she answered. "I'm done with this."
20 minutes later, I was sitting in her car, explaining my plan. I'm going to find my own neurologist, someone who actually specializes in epilepsy, not conversion disorders. Samantha had been researching epilepsy specialists ever since my status epilepticus episode. She pulled out a printed list of names. There's an epilepsy center at UC San Diego that's supposed to be one of the best in the country. Dr. Elena Rodriguez is the director. She's published like 50 papers on temporal lobe epilepsy.
We drove straight to the UCSD Medical Center. I walked into the neurology department and asked to speak with someone about scheduling an appointment with Dr. Rodriguez. The receptionist, a kind woman named Maria, looked at my medical records summary that I'd printed from my patient portal. "Honey, you've had status epilepticus and you're not on adequate medication?" she asked, frowning. "Dr. Rodriguez has a 3-month waiting list, but let me see if she can work you in sooner. This is urgent." While we waited, my phone buzzed constantly with calls from my parents. I turned it off. Dr. Rodriguez was everything I'd hoped for. She was in her 40s, with graying hair, and the confident demeanor of someone who'd spent decades treating epilepsy. She listened to my entire story without interruption, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that showed she understood exactly what I'd been through. "Abigail, I'm going to be very direct with you," she said after reviewing the brain scans from my recent hospitalization. "You have temporal lobe epilepsy, most likely caused by a genetic mutation. The evidence is overwhelming. Your seizure patterns, Todd's paralysis, the status epilepticus, and now these brain imaging changes. Anyone suggesting this is psychological is practicing medicine outside their area of expertise." She ordered comprehensive genetic testing and a video EEG, a multi-day hospital stay where I'd be monitored continuously to capture my seizures on camera while measuring brain activity. "I also want to start you on a different medication," she said. "Keppra works for some people, but given your seizure frequency, I think we need a more aggressive approach. Have your parents been supportive of your treatment?" For the first time in nearly a year, I told a doctor the complete truth about my family situation. Dr. Rodriguez listened with growing concern. "I need to ask you something important," she said when I finished. "Do you feel safe at home? Are your parents preventing you from getting necessary medical care?" I thought about it carefully. They're not trying to hurt me. They just genuinely believe I'm making this up for attention. But yes, they've been preventing me from getting proper treatment. "You're 18 now, which means you can make your own medical decisions. Would you like me to speak with them directly?" Before I could answer, my phone started buzzing again. This time it was Lucas calling, not my parents. "Abby, where are you?" he said when I answered. "Mom and Dad are freaking out. They called the police and reported you missing." I explained where I was and what I was doing. There was a long pause. "Abby," Lucas said quietly, "I believe you. I've always believed you. I only told them what they wanted to hear because I was scared they'd be mad at me too." That conversation with my brother broke something open in me. For the first time in months, I cried tears of relief instead of frustration. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for the video EEG to begin the following Monday. She also called my parents and requested a family meeting to discuss my treatment plan. The conversation, which took place in her office 3 days later, was unlike anything I'd experienced in the previous year. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Rodriguez began, "I've reviewed Abigail's medical records, and I need to address some serious concerns about the care she's been receiving." She pulled up my brain scans on her computer screen. These images show clear evidence of seizure-related brain injury. The hippocampal sclerosis, here and here, is consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy. This is not a psychiatric condition. Dad leaned forward, slipping into his lawyer mode. "Doctor, we've been working with multiple specialists who feel that Abigail's episodes are psychogenic in nature. How can you be so certain when other qualified physicians have reached different conclusions?" "Because epilepsy is my specialty," Dr. Rodriguez replied firmly. "I've been treating epilepsy for 15 years. The physicians you've been consulting with, a family therapist and a general neurologist who sees maybe 5 epilepsy patients per year, are not epilepsy specialists." She turned to address my parents directly. "Your daughter nearly died from status epilepticus. That is not a psychological condition. It's a medical emergency that could have been prevented with proper anti-seizure medication." Mom shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We were told that teenagers sometimes develop seizure-like episodes as a response to stress." "That's true," Dr. Rodriguez acknowledged. "Psychogenic non-epileptic seizures do occur, but they look very different from what Abigail experiences. They don't cause postictal confusion, they don't respond to anti-seizure medication, and they absolutely cannot cause status epilepticus or the brain changes we see on Abigail's MRI." She handed them a folder of research papers. "I want you to read these studies about genetic epilepsy syndromes. Given your family history, which you should have disclosed to every physician from the beginning, Abigail most likely has a hereditary form of temporal lobe epilepsy. The video EEG that week changed everything. Over 5 days of continuous monitoring, the medical team captured 12 seizures on camera while simultaneously recording my brain activity. The EEG showed clear epileptic discharges originating from my left temporal lobe during each episode. Dr. Rodriguez called my parents with the results. "We have definitive proof now," she told them over speakerphone while I sat in my hospital bed. "Abigail's brainwaves during seizures show classic epileptic activity. This is not debatable anymore." But the most powerful moment came when they showed my parents the video footage of one of my seizures. Watching their daughter convulse unconsciously on a hospital bed with simultaneous brainwave recordings showing electrical storms in my temporal lobe finally broke through their denial. Mom started crying. Dad sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "We were wrong," Mom finally whispered. "Oh God, Abby, we were so wrong." The genetic testing results came back 2 weeks later and confirmed Dr. Rodriguez's suspicions. I had a mutation in the SCN1A gene, which causes a form of genetic epilepsy, the same mutation that had probably caused Great-Aunt Margaret's seizures 60 years earlier. My parents' transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking at the same time. Dad threw away his seizure journal and started researching epilepsy advocacy organizations. Mom used her nursing connections to learn everything she could about seizure management and medication side effects. "I don't know how to apologize for what we put you through," Dad said one evening as we sat in the living room. "I used all my lawyer skills to build a case against you instead of fighting for you." "We failed you as parents," Mom added. "I'm a nurse. I should have known better. I should have trusted your symptoms instead of dismissing them." Lucas, who had been quiet throughout most of these family discussions, finally spoke up. "I'm sorry too, Abby. I knew you weren't faking, but I was too scared to stand up to them."
Starting on the new medication regimen Dr. Rodriguez prescribed made an immediate difference. The focal seizures that had been happening daily stopped almost completely. I went from having multiple seizures per week to having one every few months. But the most important change wasn't medical, it was psychological. For the first time in over a year, I felt heard, believed, and supported by my family. The damage to our relationships would take time to heal, but we finally had a foundation of truth to build from. When I graduated from high school that June, I walked across the stage seizure-free for the first time in 9 months. My parents were in the audience, wearing purple ribbons for epilepsy awareness. Grandma Helen and Grandpa Frank had flown in from Phoenix to watch me graduate. During my valedictorian speech, I talked about the importance of self-advocacy and never giving up when you know something is wrong with your body. I didn't mention my epilepsy specifically, but everyone who knew our family understood what I was really talking about. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to solving a problem isn't the problem itself, I said, looking directly at my parents in the audience. It's convincing the people who love you that the problem is real. After graduation, Dr. Rodriguez offered me an internship in her epilepsy research lab. "You've lived through something that most people can't imagine," she told me. "That experience, combined with your academic abilities, could help other patients who are going through what you went through." I accepted immediately. 3 years of being dismissed and gaslit had taught me that patient advocacy isn't just important, it's life-saving. Today, I'm a pre-med student at UC San Diego, planning to specialize in neurology. My seizures are well controlled on medication, and I haven't had a generalized seizure in over 2 years. My relationship with my parents has slowly healed, though there are still moments of tension when we remember how close their denial came to killing me. But the most important thing I learned from this experience is that you have to be your own advocate, especially when you're young and female and dealing with a medical system that doesn't always take you seriously. Trust your body, trust your symptoms, and never let anyone convince you that your pain isn't real, even when that someone is your own family. Because sometimes proving them wrong isn't just about being right. Sometimes it's about staying alive. 5 years later, I stood in the same hallway at Jefferson High School where I'd once collapsed during a seizure, but this time I was there as Dr. Abigail Thompson, wearing my white coat and carrying a presentation about epilepsy awareness. The irony wasn't lost on me.
Principal Martinez, now with more gray in her hair but the same warm smile, greeted me at the main office. "Abigail, I can't believe you're back here as a doctor. When I heard you were coming to speak to our health classes, I had to see it for myself." "Not quite a doctor yet," I corrected with a laugh. "I'm finishing my neurology residency at UCSD, but close enough." Walking through those familiar halls brought back a flood of memories. The chemistry lab where it all started, the calculus classroom where I nearly died, the nurse's office where I'd spent countless hours trying to convince adults that something was seriously wrong with me. My first presentation was to a group of juniors in the same AP chemistry class where my journey began. I looked out at their faces, some bored, some curious, a few scrolling through their phones, and saw myself at 17. "How many of you have ever felt like adults didn't believe you when you said something was wrong?" I asked. About half the hands in the room went up. Today, I want to tell you about the importance of trusting your body and advocating for yourself, especially when you're young and especially when you're dealing with the medical system. I shared my story, but this time from the perspective of someone who'd not only survived, but thrived. I talked about the science behind epilepsy, the genetics that had skipped generations in my family, and the breakthrough research happening in neurology labs around the world. But mostly, I talked about resilience. After the presentation, a quiet girl named Emma approached me. She had the same uncertain look I'd worn for years. "Dr. Thompson," she said hesitantly, "I've been having these weird episodes where I smell burning rubber and then can't remember things for a few minutes. My parents think I'm just trying to get out of tests." My heart stopped. Those were classic symptoms of temporal lobe seizures, the same type I'd experienced. "Emma, how long has this been happening?" "About 6 months, but my mom's a nurse, and she says if it was something serious, she'd know." I handed her my business card. "I want you to have your parents call me directly. What you're describing needs to be evaluated by a neurologist immediately." That conversation led to Emma getting properly diagnosed with epilepsy within 2 weeks. Her parents, initially skeptical, became advocates overnight when the EEG showed clear seizure activity. She started medication and became seizure-free within a month. Emma was the first of many young patients I'd encounter who were struggling to be heard by the adults in their lives. Word spread through social media and epilepsy support groups about the young neurologist who actually listened to teenagers. I started receiving emails from families across the country. One message particularly stood out. It was from a mother in Ohio whose 15-year-old son Marcus was having seizures that 3 different doctors had dismissed as attention-seeking behavior. "Dr. Thompson," she wrote, "I found your story online and it sounds exactly like what we're going through. Marcus has been having episodes for 8 months and everyone keeps telling us it's anxiety. But I watched your presentation on YouTube and his symptoms match what you described perfectly. Can you help us?" I connected Marcus's family with an epilepsy specialist in Cleveland. Within a month, he was diagnosed with juvenile myoclonic epilepsy and started on appropriate medication. His seizures stopped completely. These experiences led me to start something I called the Young Advocate Project, a nonprofit organization focused on helping teenagers navigate medical systems that often dismiss their symptoms. We created resources for both patients and families, trained healthcare providers on recognizing epilepsy in adolescents, and established a network of specialists willing to provide second opinions for disputed cases. The project's success caught the attention of the Epilepsy Foundation, and I was invited to speak at their national conference. Standing on that stage in front of hundreds of neurologists, researchers, and advocates, I thought about 17-year-old me lying in that hospital bed, desperate for someone to believe her. Medical gaslighting of young patients isn't just a communication problem, I told the audience. It's a patient safety crisis. Every day we dismiss teenage symptoms as psychological without proper evaluation, we risk missing serious neurological conditions during critical developmental windows. The presentation went viral in medical circles. I started getting invited to speak at medical schools about the importance of taking adolescent patients seriously. The phrase, "trust but verify," became my motto. Trust young patients' symptom reports, but verify with appropriate testing rather than dismissing them outright. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined during those dark years of my adolescence. Dad had become one of the Young Advocate Project's biggest supporters, using his legal skills to help families navigate insurance denials and school accommodations. Mom had taken continuing education courses in epilepsy nursing and now worked part-time at our epilepsy center.
We want to spend the rest of our careers making up for the mistakes we made with you, Mom told me during one of our monthly dinners. Lucas, now a college senior studying social work, had been profoundly affected by watching our family's journey. Seeing what you went through taught me that sometimes the people who love you most can hurt you without meaning to, he said. I want to work with families going through medical crises so I can help them communicate better. The ripple effects of our experience continued to spread in unexpected ways. Grandma Helen, now 88, had become an unlikely epilepsy advocate in her retirement community. She gave presentations about family medical histories and the importance of sharing genetic information across generations. I should have told your mother about Margaret years ago, she said during one of our visits. Shame and stigma kept our family from potentially life-saving information. Her advocacy led to 3 other residents discovering they had family histories of epilepsy that they'd never shared with their children or grandchildren. 2 of those families ended up getting genetic testing that revealed inherited epilepsy mutations. Dr. Rodriguez, my mentor and the neurologist who'd saved my life, became my research supervisor during residency. Together, we published papers on adolescent epilepsy diagnosis and the phenomenon of medical gaslighting in teenage patients. Our research showed that young women were particularly likely to have their neurological symptoms attributed to psychological causes, leading to delayed diagnoses and worse outcomes. You've turned your trauma into purpose, she told me as we reviewed data from our latest study. That's the mark of a true physician scientist. The most meaningful moment of my career so far came during my final year of residency. I was working in the pediatric epilepsy unit when a 17-year-old girl named Sarah was admitted after her 3rd seizure in 2 months. Her parents were convinced she was faking for attention, despite clear evidence of neurological problems. As I sat with Sarah and her family, explaining the results of her video EEG that showed obvious epileptic seizures, I saw my teenage self in her relieved tears and her parents' shocked expressions. Dr. Thompson, Sarah said after her parents left the room, "Thank you for believing me. I thought I was going crazy." "You're not crazy," I assured her. "You have epilepsy, and we're going to take excellent care of you." 6 months later, Sarah sent me a graduation announcement. She'd not only finished high school, but had been accepted to pre-med programs at 3 different universities. Her note read, "Dr. Thompson, you saved my life by listening to me. Someday, I want to do the same for other kids." Standing in my office that day, holding her graduation announcement, I realized that my journey had come full circle. The scared, dismissed teenager who'd fought for years to be believed had become the doctor she'd needed back then. My epilepsy was now perfectly controlled on medication. I hadn't had a seizure in over 3 years, and my latest EEGs showed no abnormal activity. But more importantly, I'd learned that surviving medical trauma isn't just about getting the right diagnosis and treatment, it's about using that experience to create change for others. The Young Advocate Project now operates in 12 states and has helped over 500 teenagers get proper neurological evaluations. We've trained thousands of healthcare providers, created educational materials for families, and established research protocols specifically focused on adolescent epilepsy. But perhaps the most important thing we've accomplished is changing the conversation. Medical schools now include training on adolescent patient advocacy. Hospital systems have implemented protocols for second opinions when teenagers report neurological symptoms. And most importantly, young patients across the country know they have advocates who will believe them and fight for their right to proper medical care. Every day, I wake up grateful for 2 things: that I survived my journey and that I can use my experience to make sure other young people don't have to fight as hard as I did to be heard. But my work was far from finished. As word spread about the Young Advocate Project, I began receiving increasingly complex cases that highlighted just how widespread the problem of medical dismissal really was. There was Kai, a 16-year-old from Seattle whose seizures only happened during sleep. His parents had been told by multiple doctors that he was experiencing night terrors and needed psychological counseling. When his mother contacted me through our helpline, I immediately recognized the symptoms of nocturnal frontal lobe epilepsy.
Within 2 weeks, we had connected him with a sleep specialist who confirmed the diagnosis through overnight EEG monitoring. Then came Maria from Phoenix, a 15-year-old whose absent seizures were so subtle that teachers thought she was simply daydreaming or being defiant. Her grades had plummeted from A's to D's over the course of a semester, and the school was threatening to place her in special education for behavioral problems. Her aunt had seen my TED Talk online and reached out desperately. After I spoke with Maria's pediatrician about childhood absence epilepsy, she was diagnosed within a week and back to honor roll status within a month of starting medication. The case that truly tested my resolve involved a 14-year-old named Jordan from rural Montana. His seizures were being attributed to drug abuse by local doctors who couldn't believe a good kid from a religious family could have neurological problems. His parents had even taken him to faith healers, convinced his episodes were spiritual rather than medical. It took 6 months of advocacy, multiple phone calls with his family doctor, and eventually flying Jordan to our epilepsy center for evaluation before we could prove his seizures were caused by a rare genetic condition called Dravet syndrome. These experiences taught me that medical gaslighting wasn't just an individual problem, it was a systemic issue that required institutional change. I began working with medical licensing boards to include patient advocacy training in continuing education requirements. I testified before state health committees about the need for standardized epilepsy protocols in emergency departments. The breakthrough came when the American Academy of Neurology invited me to chair a task force on adolescent neurological care. Our committee spent 2 years developing guidelines for healthcare providers treating teenagers with suspected seizure disorders. The guidelines emphasized the importance of detailed seizure histories, the limitations of standard EEGs, and the need for specialized epilepsy referrals when initial evaluations were inconclusive. We also created a revolutionary program called Second Opinion Saturdays, where experienced epileptologists would provide free consultations to families who felt their teenagers' symptoms weren't being taken seriously. The program launched in California and quickly expanded to 15 states within its first year. During this time, I was also completing groundbreaking research on the genetic factors that predispose teenagers to temporal lobe epilepsy. Our study, which followed 800 adolescents over 5 years, revealed that nearly 30% of teenage-onset epilepsy cases had identifiable genetic components that had been missed by standard testing. This research led to the development of more comprehensive genetic screening protocols for young epilepsy patients. The personal toll of constantly fighting systemic medical bias was significant. There were nights when I'd come home from the hospital emotionally drained after spending hours convincing colleagues to take teenage patients seriously. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in medical trauma. Ironically, the same type of therapy my parents had once insisted I needed, but for entirely different reasons. "You're carrying the weight of every dismissed patient you can't reach," my therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, observed during one of our sessions. "That's not sustainable long-term." She was right. I learned to set boundaries, to delegate more responsibilities within the Young Advocate Project, and to celebrate small victories rather than focusing only on the cases I couldn't solve.
One of those small victories became a major turning point. A medical student named Alex Chen, no relation to the dismissive Dr. Chen from my teenage years, had attended one of my lectures about adolescent epilepsy. Inspired by my story, Alex chose to do his neurology rotation specifically to learn more about teenage seizure disorders. He went on to specialize in pediatric neurology and now runs epilepsy programs at children's hospitals in 3 different cities. "Your story changed the trajectory of my entire career," Alex told me at a medical conference. "I realized that listening to patients, really listening, is just as important as any diagnostic test we can run." Alex represented a new generation of physicians who were being trained differently because of the awareness campaigns we'd launched. Medical schools across the country began incorporating patient advocacy training into their curricula. Residency programs started requiring rotations that specifically focused on adolescent care and communication skills. The transformation extended beyond medicine into unexpected areas. School districts began implementing seizure action plans that protected students from being labeled as attention seekers when they experienced neurological symptoms. Insurance companies revised their policies to cover second opinion consultations for teenage patients whose initial evaluations were inconclusive.
Even my old high school made changes. Jefferson High now has a comprehensive health education program that teaches students about neurological conditions and self-advocacy. They've installed a memorial plaque in the chemistry lab, not for me, but for all the students who've struggled to be heard when reporting medical symptoms. My parents' involvement in advocacy work had become a full-time mission for them. Dad retired early from his law practice to focus on legal advocacy for families navigating medical systems. He'd successfully challenged insurance denials for over 200 families and had lobbied for legislation requiring insurance coverage for genetic testing in suspected epilepsy cases. Mom's transformation was equally remarkable. She'd become a nationally recognized expert in epilepsy nursing and had published articles about recognizing seizures in pediatric patients. She regularly traveled to speak at nursing conferences about the importance of believing young patients' symptom reports. I spent years learning to be a better nurse, she told me recently, but I had to unlearn how to be a skeptical parent first. The most unexpected development came when Lucas graduated with his social work degree and joined our nonprofit full-time. His perspective as someone who'd witnessed our family's journey from the outside brought invaluable insights to our patient advocacy programs. I saw how the medical system can turn families against each other, he explained during his first staff meeting. Part of our job is helping families stay united while they fight for proper care. Lucas developed our family counseling component, which provides support to families struggling with medical uncertainty. His program has helped hundreds of families navigate the emotional challenges of seeking diagnoses for complex neurological conditions. As I reflected on the 7 years since my diagnosis, I realized that my seizures had ultimately given me something invaluable, a purpose that aligned perfectly with my skills and passions. Every patient I helped, every medical student I trained, every family that found hope through our advocacy work represented a victory not just for them, but for the scared 17-year-old who'd once felt completely alone in a hospital bed. The ripple effects continue to expand in ways I never could have imagined. Former patients were becoming advocates themselves. Medical students were choosing neurology careers inspired by patient stories, and families were sharing their experiences to help others avoid similar struggles. Because in the end, that's what medicine should be about, not just treating diseases, but ensuring that every patient, regardless of age, feels heard, believed, and cared for. Sometimes the most powerful thing a doctor can say isn't a diagnosis or a treatment plan. Sometimes it's simply, "I believe you." And sometimes those 3 words can change not just one life, but an entire system. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.